So, one of your clients has just come in and asked you to write a report confirming their diagnosis. Can you do it? This is a question that comes up all the time in supervision, and today I'd like to unpack the question as well as the underlying assumptions. First off, are you qualified to make a diagnosis? Of course you are. If you are an Australian psychologist, the skill of making a diagnosis according to the DSM is one of the core competencies of your registration. You have the training, you have the expertise, and you have all of the tools available to you in order to make a diagnosis. But sometimes your diagnosis isn't good enough. And that is a question that's less about your skill and more about politics, history, and the meaning of diagnosis. So let's try and unpack that today in this video. First off, we need to understand a little bit more about what diagnosis is, what it isn't, as well as what it's being used for. Let's go right back to the beginning and start off with two schools of thought in diagnosis. The first is nosology, and the second is pathology. Nosology is a description of the disease. If you go back and read some of the ancient writings of Galen and Hippocrates in the early days of medicine, before they had microscopes, before they had an understanding of anatomy and physiology, these are nosological documents. If you ever want to be depressed, go and read Hippocrates, who describes what sound like contemporary diseases with a short note about how soon the person will die as a result of the disease. Nosology is a description of disease which helps us to understand the patterns and the meaning of those diseases. It's very different but linked to pathology. Pathology takes those nosological constructions and clusters and looks for the underlying mechanism. From a modern medicine point of view, we now have an understanding of the pathology that underlies tuberculosis, the pathology that underlies HIV, and the pathology that underlies cancer. But we don't have that in mental illness. All we have are nosological descriptions. The DSM itself is a nosological document. The authors of the DSM-3 made a critical decision in the 1980s, in fact in 1980. The decision was psychologists and psychiatrists couldn't come up with an agreement on what caused schizophrenia, what caused trauma, what caused neurosis. What we could agree to is what these descriptions looked like, what these disorders looked like, and how we could describe them in a meaningful way. So the DSM-3 decided to sacrifice validity and etiology for the sake of reliability. When one clinician looks at the DSM-3 or 4 or 5 and says, you meet all of the checkboxes for panic disorder or PTSD, any other clinician should be able to look at the same set of symptoms and meet an agreement. But it comes at a trade-off because it doesn't have pathology, and it doesn't have etiology, and it doesn't speak to treatment. So why bother just having this great big descriptive document? Well, first off, it's fantastic for research. The nosological approach lets us cluster groups of patients together who all meet criteria for a particular disorder, and that helps the researchers who are studying pathology look for the underlying mechanisms. But as of today, there is no assay or blood test or brain scan or genetic test that will positively identify you for any disorder within the DSM. The second thing that diagnosis is fantastic for is it's a shorthand form of communication. When I write a letter to you saying, hey, I'm going on long service leave and I'm referring you one of my clients, and I say they've got a diagnosis of major depressive disorder in the context of a dependent personality disorder, without me writing a 2-page essay, you've got a broad description about what this person is likely to present with, what kind of treatment needs they might have, and what you should be looking for. So, diagnosis is super handy for research and super handy as shorthanded communication between clinicians. What's it not good for? Now, firstly, what it's not good for is funding. The DSM was never designed to be used to allocate funding. Let me be clear, there is no relationship between meeting the diagnostic thresholds within the DSM or the ICD for that matter and how much money or how much treatment a person will need. Imagine a person who's had a severe car accident and is presenting with some symptoms of trauma. They had the accident, so that's criterion A sorted out. They report nightmares and flashbacks, criteria B. They won't get in a car anymore, either as a driver or a passenger, check for criterion C. They've got a whole bunch of negative beliefs and cognitions about their role in the accident and how unsafe they are on the road, criterion D, check. But no matter how many ways you ask it, they aren't experiencing any hyperarousal. There's no jumpiness, no irritation. Sorry, but that person doesn't get a diagnosis of PTSD. Does that mean that their trauma is not real? Does it mean that they don't need help? Does it mean that they won't benefit from therapy? Of course it doesn't. But diagnosis has become a lazy way for insurance assessors to approve or reject claims. This is such a complete perversion of what the DSM was ever designed for. To illustrate that point, I'd just like to read a section from the front of the DSM-5 TR. However, the diagnosis of a mental disorder is not equivalent to a need for treatment. Clinicians may thus encounter individuals whose symptoms do not meet full criteria for a mental disorder, but who demonstrate a clear need for treatment or care. The fact that some individuals do not show all symptoms of a diagnosis should not be used to justify limiting their access to appropriate care. The authors of the DSM understood its limitations. It's useful for us communicating with each other. It's not useful as a binary decision maker about people's access to treatment. But despite this very clear advice from the people who literally wrote the DSM, that is how diagnosis is being used in contemporary society. It's being used to gatekeep money and it's being used to gatekeep treatment. This happens in Medicare, it happens in workers' compensation schemes, it happens in insurance, and it happens in the NDIS. Now, it's important to understand that diagnosis itself is basically irrelevant for any of those purposes. So the question is not, am I qualified to make a diagnosis? The question is, does the person who is sitting on this pot of money accept my qualifications to make a diagnosis? Because some of these gatekeepers require a clinical psychologist, some of them require a psychiatrist, some of them require a GP, and some of them just accept the diagnostic label. Once you reframe the question, the answer becomes pretty clear. Now, there's a whole different question about whether or not you should be providing these kind of diagnostic opinions for people that you treat in therapy, but that's a video for another day. If you found this video helpful, please share it with your friends and consider a like and subscribe.